Distinguished participants, I'm the moderator of the session. Welcome to session 4, Water Stress and Mass Migration. As I have been introduced, my name is Ahmet Saatçi. I'm the president of the Turkish Water Institute. We will talk about how to prevent water stress, and we will try to link it to mass migration. I have two keynote speakers. I will introduce them to you in a while. And they will give us, as the name indicates, the keynote, like in music, the pitch for tuning the music. And we will try to understand the water stress problems and how we can solve it. Let me introduce our keynote speakers first. My first keynote speaker is His Excellency Bekir Pakdemirli. Is the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry of Turkey. This is the minister responsible for the sanitation and water aspects of the refugees. He served in the foundation and management of various companies. He has a BS degree in business administration, MBA, and a PhD degree in economics. Well, I also know that he's a captain and a pilot license. I think he will take us through the troubled waters of refugee crisis, or maybe fly us over. So as you may know, we have about 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey recently. My second speaker is Mr. Nizar Zahid. He's sitting next to the minister. He is the global lead. He's from the Global Lead Water Islamic Development Bank. He has been employed by the Islamic Development Bank for 22 years. He has a PhD in water from National Laboratory Water Engineering from National Laboratory for Public Works, France. He has an MS degree in water pollution from INSA, Toulouse, France, Application Sciences and National Institute, INSA. He worked in urban water development projects in Indonesia in 25 countries. In Africa, Asia, and Middle East. He has a vast experience with the water systems, and he has accompanied the identification and implementation of these projects. So we have 4 distinguished panelists. I will start with the ladies. Mr. Wambui Guchuri is the Director for Water Development and Sanitation, African Development Bank. She worked in the World Bank, as a water practice manager, Africa region. At the World Bank, she was responsible for the water resource management, irrigation, and drainage in 12 countries. She holds a BS degree in economics and sociology and a MS degree in economics. Our second panelist is that we have Charles, but I will start with Gonzalez. That's what my paper says. He's the Deputy Secretary General for Water, Environment, and Blue Economy, Union for the Mediterranean. He's a diplomat who has served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Spain and European Union. He's a counselor at the Embassy of Spain in Rabat, Morocco. He has been a member of the Spanish Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. He has a wide experience in the Mediterranean region with a special focus on negotiations for conflict management. He holds a degree in political science and sociology in law and executive master in conflict management and resolution from Harvard University. My other speaker is Charles Iceland. He is the Director, Global and National Water Initiative, World Resources Institute. He has an important project which we will discuss, which is called Aqueduct. It's a high-resolution global water risk assessment mapping tool. It's quite interesting because he is trying to use artificial intelligence to predict the water crisis. So we will probably have some questions on that, and we'll discuss it. He has worked with several major international companies. He holds an undergraduate degree from Yale University and a master's degree from Columbia University in international affairs. Kiron, or Queen, you may meet him from the last panel. He is the director of the Middle East Desalination Research Center. I think it's in Oman. Mr. O'Quinn is a specialist in public policy and international relations, particularly transboundary environmental issues. More importantly, he spent more than a decade working in the Irish peace process. That's something we need. He's a policy advisor to 3 government departments. He holds degrees in public policy and history from Trinity College Dublin and the School of Oriental and African Studies, London. Now, before we get into the keynote speeches, just some statistics. Half of the refugees in the world they reside in 6 countries. So Pakistan has 5%, Uganda has 5%, Lebanon 6%, West Bank Gaza 9%, Jordan 11%, Turkey 14%. So if you add Turkey and Jordan, it makes 25%. That means a quarter of the refugees, they reside only in 2 countries. So is this fair? We will discuss that. What's the responsibility of the international community? These are some of the topics we will talk. Now I will give the floor to His Excellency Bekir Pakdemirli, who will give us a host country perspective. After his speech, he has to leave because he has an urgent cabinet meeting in Ankara. So we will probably excuse him for that. So please, His Excellency Bekir Pakdemirli.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to extend my deepest appreciation to the Government of Hungary and Organization Committee of the Budapest Water Summit for this great organization. I have been to many organizations until now, including Davos, and we were always talking about a better future. And I realized one of a sudden that what we are doing is very good. We have very good intentions, but what we were doing is in general in a planning stage or in a pilot stage. Good implementations touching to millions of people were absent there. Today, I will provide you the samples, the concrete samples of what has been done in greater scale. I am coming from a family who is forced to leave their home twice. Believe me, it's a tragedy. My family moved from Macedonia to Turkey at the beginning of 20th century. The trauma is still there. We still feel the trauma in the family. I remember that my grandmother was always missing her own town and telling me how great it was, their very own house. I was always remembering she was always saving bucks, a couple of bucks, just to be prepared for the unexpected. After she passed away, we have found many pieces of coins and money around the house in hidden places. Unfortunately, we didn't become rich because there was high amount of inflation at those times in Turkey. But I hope she rests in peace because she was always seeking for peace. Following the so-called Arab Spring, the uprising and the conflict in Syria, tragedy started in 2012, early 2012. For those people who had to leave their houses, abandoned houses, abandoned villages, abandoned lives, and abandoned places. Until the 20th century, we have lived with Syrians together for exactly 402 years. Today, we have borders, but our hearts beat together. We couldn't resist the emergency call from our neighbors, from our brothers, where their life was in danger, where they lost not only their houses and dreams, but also their lives. For centuries, people tried to settle down near water resources. Water is the beginning of life, but at the same time, water is the end of life. Water is a motivation for expanding the civilizations. Emperor Attila chased the water path to reach the fertile lands of Europe. Water can also cause people to migrate, and addressing this problem is our responsibility as ministers, decision makers, water professionals, and scientists here in this summit. On the other hand, conflict and mass migration create water stress in the host countries. Here is another example. The conflict in Yemen has threatened millions of lives. 3.6 million people have been forced to flee their homes because of increased violence in their country. Yemen experienced the largest cholera epidemic in the world, and children in Yemen died to water and food scarcity and the epidemics. We are not the richest country in the world, but by far we are the leading country in the humanitarian aid in the world. Isn't this ironic? No, it's not. It's the real truth. When you look at the figures, most of the Syrian refugees stayed in the neighboring countries, whereas the total number of Syrian refugees in all the European countries is around only 1 million. Hosting such a large number of Syrians brings many responsibilities for Turkey: security, housing, food, education, water, sanitary, and health services. The challenge was not only to provide services for Syrians, but to provide our brothers a welfare level, humane, and remarkably real. By the end of this September, while only 1.7% of Syrians are living in the temporary shelter centers, the rest reside in cities, towns, and villages throughout the country. This makes more than 98%. This makes Turkey's experience a very unique case. Also, we still carry some camps, and currently there are 7 state-run temporary protection centers in the southeastern Turkey, close to the Syrian border. Turkey constructed all the necessary water and sanitation infrastructure in the camps, ensured a minimum 130 liters of water per person per day. All preventive health measures were taken. As a result, there is no epidemic of waterborne diseases. What did we do outside the camps? Because the camp population is very small, regarding the infrastructure. For those Syrian brothers who were already blended with our social and economic life. In this map, you can see the top 10 provinces where our Syrian guests are living. In the first 2 years of flows of Syrians, population in these cities reached levels that normally would be reached in 15 years. As a striking case, the population of the border province of Kilis doubled with over 120,000 Syrians settled in the city. Can you imagine that? Population of a city is doubling in just 2 years. One day, it was very, very early in the morning, I received a call. I received an emergency call. I was sleeping very deeply. The owner of the call was the mayor of Kilis. He called me. Probably it was 6 o'clock in the morning. He called me, "Selamun Aleyküm." I told him, "Aleyküm Selam." He said only one sentence: "We are out of water." I received the message and an emergency plan deployed very fast. We have drilled 32 wells with lightning speed, and we went for a call for tender for a transmission line for the Upper Afrin Dam for 43 kilometers to be finished only in 1 year. It is finishing this November. We did the similar thing in Gaziantep, Hatay, and in some major cities. We built dams, we built water and wastewater treatment plants, and we built the water supply network where it is necessary. Needless to mention, maintenance and rehabilitation of the existing infrastructure in those cities where Turkish citizens blended with the Syria. Turkey has spent almost $40 billion for Syrians. I don't want to mention here the amount that we have taken from the International Committee. It is very, very small. So it's a big burden, it's a big price to pay only for one country. And we are estimating that 5% of this money has been spent for the water-related activities. We have done not only with the infrastructure things like water, sanitation, and other services, but we need to make sure that our Syrian brothers has to blend with our community as well. So 92,000, more than 92,000 Syrians granted Turkish citizenship. And we don't want them in a residential segregation. And they are not living in ghettos, as you have seen. They are living in mixed neighborhoods with the Turkish citizens. Syria's territorial integrity is more important than ever for Turkey and for the region. Turkey has recently started a military operation against terrorist organizations, terrorist groups in Syria's northeastern region. The actual goal is to establish a safe zone that will serve two purposes. One is to secure Turkey's border with Syria by eliminating terrorist elements such as ISIS, we call Daesh, and the PKK, YPG, and PYD. And the other is to create a space for the refugees, safe space for refugees to return voluntarily and safely to their homes. Turkey has no interest in occupying any part of Syria. This is not a move against the Kurds. Turkey doesn't have any problem with Kurds. We are fighting against terrorist organizations that has killed and oppressed the Kurdish people as well. We have no interest in altering demographics in the region. Our interest is to re-establish the proper demography that has been altered by the terrorist organizations. When the area is secured, we are planning to develop projects in the area, agriculture and irrigation projects, drinking water infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and 200,000 housing units. Estimated cost of the project is more than $26 billion. We welcome all the international community to participate in this project. And we are aiming 1 to 2 million Syrians can return their homelands voluntarily and safely. I want all of you to take a closer look at this photo. This photo belongs to a child. I want all of you to remember his name. His name is Aylan Kurdi. He is a son. He is a beloved son of a Syrian refugee family that he was trying to travel to his dreams. He started the journey to his hopes, but unfortunately paid with his life. Imagine for just a second, I'm pretty sure that many of you have children. Just a second. What if he was your son? What would you think? Does it matter if Aylan is Shintoist, Buddhist, Jewish, Christian, Muslim? Does it matter Aylan is black or white? This is where words fail. We are all human and we deserve better. Syria is crying. Where is the rest of the world? Thank you very much.
We thank His Excellency. Now we have our second keynote speaker, Mr. Nizar Zaid. He will talk about water and mass migration, and he will ask the question, what can we do? Mr. Nizar, please.
Good morning, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to thank you, first of all, to be here and to listen to us for this keynote address in this morning. But before that, we have also to thank the government of Hungary and the organizing committee for inviting the bank to speak about this very difficult subject. Maybe I will start my presentation by giving you this number, and maybe Someone want to volunteer an educated guess, maybe? Okay. The answer to this question is actually comes from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, which tells us that in 2017, about 8.8 million people actually moved internally due to disasters. The displacement, when there are natural disasters or hazards, people usually tend to stay with national borders. I think that's the majority of the people. So basically, this is to dispel a myth that people would be crossing the border and living abroad. The first reflex, I would say, is to go within their national borders. But then, of course, sometimes also we have displacements which happen across the borders, and this is in combination with other situations, conflict, violence, etc. And as the Minister Bekdemirli just mentioned to us in his previous talk. When we talk about the environmentally induced displacement and mobility, we have basically three categories of people. There are people who have more or less the option, I would say, may leave, because the situation is deteriorating steadily but gradually. So this is the first category of people who would be mobile or displaced. The second category includes people who are forced to displace, to move actually, because there is something inevitable, there is something grave, and it is happening soon. And of course, the third category of people are those who have to flee for their lives because of the wars, because of the situation, and because of the what's happening, an unfolding catastrophe, because of actually an environmental impacts. And talking about impacts, let me share with you this graph. I'm sure plenty of people here around are aware of this. You know that the World Economic Forum, every year they go to the ski station in Davos in Switzerland. They meet in January, politicians, CEOs, decision makers. And in addition to that, the World Economic Forum will publish their annual report about the risks. And what is remarkable, really, that for the last 8 years, since 2012, we have water supply crisis in the top 5 risks in terms of impact. The impact I just spoke about in the previous slide, okay? So you can see it in 2019, for example, water crisis comes number 4. So we know that the impact is very, very serious, and as I said, it has been documented in these by this annual publication. Now, linking this to the water sector, but again, we have the map here of water resources allocation worldwide, and these are 2 maps, basically. One for the situation in 2000, and another one for the situation in 2050. And we can see that if you compare this map with the next one, you can see, you can see that the migration movements are more or less mirroring this situation of the scarcity in 2050. I mean, there is, for example, you can see for Africa and the Middle East, where we expect water allocation to go below 1,000 cubic meters per person per year, and you can see movement of migration in that part of the world. So this is really something really very, very alarming, should be alarming to everyone in this, to every decision maker. And what's interesting, actually, and as I said it earlier at the beginning, that most of the movement remain within the countries. People do not cross the border necessarily. And where do they go? Usually they go to urban areas. Why? Because urban areas offer many opportunities and there is plenty of water. This graph actually tells us that around 2007, 2008, for the first time in human history, we have 50% of people living in urban areas, more or less 50-50, and this is growing. We expect that 2/3 of the human population will be living in urban areas by the year 2050. So migration becomes an urban affair, because this growth actually in urban areas is not only indigenous, it's not coming from the natural demographic growth within the city only, but also from all these migrants who are usually coming from within the country to go into urban areas. And these usually, when they go to the urban areas, they don't go to the posh area. For example, here in Hungary, they will not go to the Buda part of the city, actually. They would go rather to the outskirts where the slums, and they constitute the slums. They have no access to water, and it becomes actually, they are compounding the problems of urbanization we all know about in terms of access to water, electricity, energy, transportation, housing, land planning, etc., etc. So basically, in this situation, we are moving the problem from the rural areas, from the water scarcity to the outskirts of the city. And this creates a lot of challenges, of course, for example, for the utilities who are operating the water supply and sanitation system. What are we doing in the Islamic Development Bank about this issue? I mean, I want to just share with you some examples. I don't pretend to be exhaustive here, but I will just share with you some examples of actions we have taken in the past few years to help tackle this challenge. The first one is what we call the GCFF, which is Global Concessional Facility. Actually, we wanted to mobilize concessional financing for countries where there are a large number of migrants, or if you call them refugees, depends on the definition, legal definition. We'll come to this, I think, in the panel discussion. So actually, it's to mobilize the international community to address the financing needs of these middle-income countries, because there are some countries which cannot borrow at normal rates, so we have to give them concessional resources. And we combine here donor contributions or our loans so that we can provide the public good. And I will give you here two examples we have done in the recent years. We worked in Jordan and in Lebanon. They are receiving quite a large number of refugees. The projects here I'm mentioning are in the health sector. Let's be clear. I mean, we provide $150 million for Jordan and $150 million for Lebanon on concessional terms with our colleagues with the World Bank in co-financing these programs. And we are trying to help restore or improve the health system in these two countries. But we can also use this in the water supply and sanitation, trying to use the same mechanism, basically, to try to provide additional resources and water so using the GCFF, Global Concessional Financial Facility, for the sector. Another possibility, as you know, I'm sure you are aware of what's happening to the Rohingya in Myanmar, etc., and the number of people who are displaced, etc. And for this, we were able to mobilize money from philanthropy from the region, actually from the Middle East, where the Islamic Development Bank is based. We provided some financing, it's grant money. We worked with international NGOs and with the UN system, UNHCR, UNICEF, you name it. I mean, I like IFRC or Human Relief Foundation or Hope Foundation from the US to help implement these projects. We were able to implement some actions basically in Myanmar first, and then move to Bangladesh to help these people live with the situation. Another program we have done actually is what we call East Africa Regional Dryland Program. It covers 3 countries, Djibouti, Somalia, and Uganda, 5 years each, and the bank contribution is $35 million, usually it's concessional terms. And here we wanted to reduce the vulnerability and to build resilience for the populations so that they can stay in their own native places, if you want, where they have a livelihood. In other words, here we are trying to work upstream and taking preventive measures instead of doing curative measures. In summary, I would say I would like to go with a few key points from this short talk. First of all, the problem is complex, and human beings do not move for one single reason, but usually for a multitude of reasons. One. The second key message I wanted to mention here is that when human beings move, they usually tend to stay within their own countries. They don't cross the border easily, and it's not their first reflex, their first reaction. They move to urban areas usually, and then it creates problems and it creates a lot of challenges for them and for the policymakers. The third message, at least from our experience in the bank, how we can help solve this problem, basically. First of all, we try to provide resources, cheap resources, which we grant money, we mobilize this money. If we cannot do that, then we go for concessional financing to help these countries and these populations. But, and this is what I mentioned about our program and the Island program, is prevention, actually. Creating the conditions for people not to move, but rather to have a livelihood and to stay with their own areas. You see, we heard just from the minister, Biki, who left us, how sad was his grandmother when she had to leave her place, and how she was, saving money, pennies, etc., to maybe with the hope to return to their home, to her own country. So really, prevention, the word prevention is better than curing. I think this is really something we should all work for. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nazar. Please. I have prepared questions based on two items. First, I thought I would have questions from the source countries, the originating, the refugees, the countries where refugees come. What can we do there? And the second is the host countries. But listening to the panels before this, I think I'll change my mind and I will just throw questions to everybody instead of going one by one, if you let me. Depending on the presentations we have just seen, yesterday in the panel, I think you have said banks are not generous people. They are not, they have to make profits, yes. So we have two bank owners here. Are you really trying to make profits, or can we have a water bank without any profits? Will it be sustainable? Ladies first, maybe.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting us to be on this panel, and thank you for the presentations, great, very personal human stories. I would like to base my responses on what we're doing at the African Development Bank, and especially in some of the most vulnerable and fragile countries or parts of countries in Africa. And many of those countries actually cannot borrow. So much of the support given to, for example, countries like Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, and many other countries in the Sahel and Horn of Africa, the bank is providing support as grant. Just last week, the bank approved a grant of about $35 million to go to Sudan. And the reason for that is, one, the bank doesn't leave because countries can't borrow. Actually, the bank will be the last one to leave. In Sudan right now, as I said, Sudan cannot borrow, but there are many, many opportunities that $35 million for the large borrowers or the large countries with large programs or countries in stability may not seem like a lot of money, but the $35 million in rural areas in Sudan is life-changing for a lot of people. And here's what we find is that it's not just water services that are lacking, it's development in general. No schools, no hospitals, no sanitation, no water services. So going in there, understanding that these places are very far away from development activities, very far away from, and that feeds to and contributes to instability. Water is is a contributing factor, but also a compounding factor. And to use that as an entry point without complicating the problem too much, use that as an entry point to hit many other challenges that they face. So what this project does is mostly finance infrastructure, which, as you all know, in these kinds of countries, and in particular where we are intervening, the gap, the absence of it is overwhelming. So it's infrastructure to build storage, to build resilience, provide very small dams that can provide water supply, can provide livestock, water for livestock, but also can provide water for micro irrigation. And in some of the dynamics is that there's a lot of conflict between farming communities and herding communities. So if you provide at least more watering points, you take away the conflict for not just between farmers, but between farmers and herders in the same communities, but between different communities. We also find that it's important to take a livelihoods approach to make sure that we can also, for example, if you have micro irrigation, that you also build skills. That you also invest in expanding schools. If you find a school, put a little bit of money in building more classrooms, put a little bit of money in building health centers, put some money in sanitation and hygiene so that you can also help increase enrollment and retention rates for girls. But also that it's very important to take a livelihoods approach because these populations are lacking in just about everything. So one, using water as the entry point, looking beyond. We also find that we don't have a lot of knowledge about how to work with these communities. So we have to really rely on themselves, developing their capacities, but also other local organizations, and making sure that as much as possible, things can be managed locally, but there's a district or a provincial government to help with the standards, with the larger than usual repairs, etc. So I think in some of these countries, Somalia, for example, the bank is in some cases going to be their largest partner, and not just through our money, but because we can use our money to leverage the money of other MDBs and other players, etc.
Thank you. Well, to both banks, I mean, if you invest in infrastructure, do you think you can prevent mass migration? You think you can stop it, or? I'm trying to be provocative.
I think we can certainly reduce by making areas attractive. People don't leave, something has to be very wrong for people to walk away from an amazing livelihood. And in my view, taking a livelihoods approach, and by the way, what I mentioned is just one project, a water project. There are other projects, from where the entry point is the agriculture sectors. So I think that, especially where you have pastoral communities, it's the men who move around with the livestock. The women and the youth stay behind. If you can involve women more in developing solutions, and the youth in developing solutions, I think investing more on the pull factors so that areas can be as attractive as possible to stay. You may not stop everything, but at least you can probably contribute to reducing mass migration.
Thank you. I'm going to give you two in one, actually, and try to address your previous question regarding whether we are here for profits. I don't think development banks are here to make profits, and I haven't heard of any development bank which distributes dividends at the end of the year, at the end of the fiscal year. We are actually just here to provide development and to provide resources as concessional as we can mobilize from the market. If not, we will give these at a rate and a small margin to cover just our administrative expenses. You asked the question, Dr. Sachi, whether a bank, water bank, will be I don't think, you see, I've been attending the World Water Forum since 2000, actually, just after Marrakesh, you know, and I heard a lot about water financing, but it has never came. It has never come, and the push for water, unfortunately, or the resources have never been provided sufficiently. However, for example, when I look at other sectors, for example, there was last week, I think, a meeting in Lyon about the HIV/AIDS and the fund for the malaria, etc. You know, there is a lot of money for going to that sector. I see a lot of philanthropy going to the education sector. There is what we call Global Partnership for Education, and they are having the meeting next week, this week actually, at the end of this week in Washington, D.C. So maybe we can use these entry points actually to push for our water sector by teaming up with the health team, with the education, etc., to have integrated actions, if you want, so that we can succeed in mobilizing additional resources for the water sector. Now, mass migration. First of all, I would like to ask you, what would you call mass migration, actually?
That was my question.
Okay, because you see, where do you put the
next question?
Oh, okay. Because where would you put the cursor, actually, to say this is mass migration? And to answer the question in a very short way, do you see people, for example, in Las Vegas, which is dry, I think, to the best of my knowledge, or Nevada, mass migrating from the US? No, because they have the resources, and the country has the technology and have the ability, actually, to provide the water resources through water transfers and through different options, so that the people would not leave. So if we can succeed in doing this, we will at least eliminate one cause of mass migration, because for conflicts and for civil unrest and all these other things, I think this is maybe something very difficult. Thank you.
So, Mr. O'Quinn, do you think, there are good banks and there are, good-hearted banks?
Absolutely.
They say they don't
Especially
have
when I want their
profits.
money. I say they're great. Yeah, I think one of the problems with this sector is that when water people or climate change people look at any problem, they tend to find what they're an expert in that problem. So if you look at people like political geographers like Jan Selby, who've looked at the civil war in Syria and found out that actually water and climate were not actually, we're not 1, 2, 3 or 4 in the things. If you look close enough, you will find water as a reason for any conflict, but way, way, way down the line. Similarly with climate change, people in this sector, it is perfectly normal, perfectly human, perfectly understandable that if I'm an expert in X, I'm a solution looking for a problem, and I will examine everything, and I will find an issue in that. So the banks have a very important role to play, but where banks don't play a role is the sort of the human factor in these conflicts, these crises that we deal with. So a lot of the issues we have to deal with there are actually capacity within the state to take money, to deal with money, to spend money, peace processes, diplomatic structures to deal with these crises over a long period. The actual best solution we need for the problems we have that we're all talking about this week is a return to a rights-based and justice-based international order. Everything else is playing around the edges. Until we return to a day where country X can't cross the border of country Y, where country X can't occupy country Y, where international resolutions of the UN Security Council are annoyed, we're just playing games. Everything else is a small side thing. The biggest maximizer of the power of a bank is an international order, peace and development. Everything else is a side issue.
As for all of you, these investments, are we proactive in these, or are we just investing when the problem happens? Are we intervening or are we preventing? Any ideas on this? I mean, please go ahead, please.
Yes, this works. Yes, thank you. Good morning. Okay. Well, I think we are beginning, answering to your question, we are beginning to intervene. Water stress, water scarcity is not anymore only an environmental problem, it's politics. And first of all, when we come here today to talk about migration and water, I think we need, when we talk about migration, first to be calm, to have a serene debate, to fight the stereotypes, Migration is not a crime. We had to differentiate between mass migration due to conflict, which is a drama, not only a crime, far from that, it's a drama, and regular migration from countries whose people don't have hope, don't have jobs, and they are forced to migrate. You know, when you leave your house, it's not because you are looking for fun, it's because you are in need. Until now in Barcelona, in the Union for the Mediterranean, we have the siege there, but until August I was in Morocco, I was working for the Spanish embassy. And a few months ago, the BBC broadcasted a program saying that 70% of the youth in Morocco wanted to migrate by all means. I think the figure is exaggerated, but at least 40–50% they are willing to migrate. The question is why? And we shouldn't criminalize these people because they don't have jobs, they don't have hope, they don't have future. We have to go to the countries of origin. I think some banks are already helping. I know the Islamic Bank, for instance, they are putting half of the budget to make a big infrastructure in Gaza, the Gaza desalination plant, which is not a normal project. It's a humanitarian emergency because 95% of the water in Gaza is not drinkable anymore. And in 2–3 years, there will not be water at all drinkable in Gaza. So it's an emergency. So we need to, as I said before, to come down. When you see the figures of those countries welcoming so many migrants, we are very thankful to Turkey to do what they are doing. I don't agree with the Minister of Agriculture justifying a military operation that has been condemned by the European Union. It has no basis at all. This is a different issue. But when you see those countries, Lebanon, Jordan, which is making a huge effort, also Turkey and other countries welcoming so many migrants, you have to tell Europeans that we need to calm down. The figures in Europe are not exaggerated. We need to look where is the origin of this migration. What can we do? This is politics. And we have to get involved in doing infrastructure, building infrastructure, giving hope, creating jobs. I think this is one of your next questions. In the countries of origin, and the water sector is also an opportunity for creating jobs. I think we will come to that later. I think.
You have some comments.
I'm not a bank. So I don't have much to say on this, but I do notice that in the United States, when we look at climate change related problems, we see both financial markets and markets in general, housing markets, respond to some of the increasing problems we're seeing with disruptions in the water cycle. There are insurers that won't insure certain parts of the coastal United States because it's too dangerous, too expensive for them, or the rates go up, or the value of people's houses go down and they can't sell it. So the banks and the financial markets do send us a signal that bad things are happening, and they signal us to respond.
Well, it's very much related, what we are discussing, to what you're working on, the aqueduct. I like it because it's an engineering approach to social sciences, as I would put it. So you work on different indicators. So can you feel that a water scarcity and some problems will occur in a region by your program? I mean, using your program. What do you do with this program?
Yeah, well, I used to manage the aqueduct program. We launched it in 2009, about 10 years ago.
It's free, right? That's the part
free.
I like, yeah.
It's free. You can go online, access the data, download the data. For some of even the computer code, you can download it. So, and we have lots of technical information that provides transparency on what we're doing. But in terms of the indicators that indicate that problems may be brewing, that water risk is mounting, we have several categories. First category, it looks at chronic water risk and risk that exists in the background year in and year out. For example, water stress, using too much water on a consistent basis relative to what you get from rainfall. but there are also other chronic indicators. How prone are you to drought? How prone are you to flooding? Some places are more prone to those than others. For example, India and Bangladesh are more prone to flooding. Then there are the episodic risk indicators, so drought anomalies. Is precipitation unusually low given 1, 2, 3 year averages? Is crop health okay? We can measure crop health from satellites. We can see how much water crops are transpiring. If they're transpiring less than usual, means that there's probably some degree of crop failure occurring. We also look at water quality impairment, both from industrial pollutants, from agricultural pollutants, from incursion of saltwater into freshwater sources. And then, of course, there's lack of access to water services. There might be enough water in the river or in aquifers, but there's not the infrastructure to get it to people, especially the poorer people at prices that they can afford. And then there are indicators of problems with infrastructure, high non-revenue water, that is loss of water from water systems, stolen water, low investments in water utilities and services, and then poor utility financial performance. And we heard yesterday that water utilities are not a, net positive earning venture, but I would counter that there are good examples of water utilities, even in poor countries, that are servicing most of the people in their areas of service. Poor people are getting access, and their financial performance is good. And so what I would say is, can we emulate what those utilities are doing in all the rest of the utilities of the world that are not performing so well?
And they are real-time simulations?
Well, so Aqueduct looks more at chronic risk. Now, I think what you're getting at is this new artificial intelligence-based model that we're developing at WRI. We have a number of partners, European and North American partners in the Water, Peace, and Security Initiative. And here we're using, I want to take a little of the mystification out of AI or machine learning. It's basically just that computers are now powerful enough to discern patterns in large data sets. And so in this particular project, we're trying to predict conflict over the next 12 months. And we are looking at over 80 indicators that might help predict this, water risk indicators, but also indicators of political, social, economic, and demographic conditions. And so the reason we're doing this is because early detection can lead to early action and mitigate, perhaps prevent conflict and destabilizing migration, perhaps mitigate the extent to which that happens. And we're coming out with this new model in a couple months' time. So far, the top predictive indicators, and this is interesting, are the demographic indicators. So population density, rural population have high predictive value. Also, the real-time water risk indicators of precipitation anomalies and evapotranspiration anomalies are highly predictive. There are a number of economic indicators that are highly predictive, such as the value of rainfed crop production, percent employment in agriculture, GDP per capita. And finally, I'd say that conflict today is an indicator that you'll likely see conflict in the future. So we use that as a momentum variable, and that's predictive.
You have many indicators. Well, what is the most important one?
The demographic indicator, that was the most eye-opening, was population and population dynamics are so closely intertwined with conflict. And, that tells you something that we can't get away from, but we also often try to get away from talking about population. But in a lot of these places, populations have quadrupled in the past 50 years. You're getting more and more competition over scarce water and land resources. You have pastoralists and farmers vying for either the same amount of resources or even diminishing resources in some cases. You have cities that are growing and becoming very susceptible to becoming day zero cities. So, we saw Chennai and Cape Town, but I think back to Sao Paulo, and they came dangerously close to running out of water. And I would never expect a Brazilian city to be reaching that point. And yet, there they are, a metropolitan area probably of some 20 million people, and droughts are now happening that didn't used to happen there.
I see the bank people are taking notes. Do you think it will be useful for you to predict the stress before it happens? Can you use it in your bank? Investments and other parts? I'm trying to sell the program a little bit,
I think you have a special skill you are reading on my mind, actually.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking when I go back to the office, just share it with my colleague and run it and see what we can do out of it, actually. What would be the results, what would be the data required, and see how this model can work. And of course, we can share it with especially it's a free tool, so nothing prevents us from using it. Yeah, why not?
Okay. So to change the topic a little bit, the minister talked about integration of the refugees into urban life. Do you think it's a sustainable way of, hosting the refugees? Should we keep them in camps, or should we, if we keep them in camps, how would we help them? Just give, I just want to hit the international community. The burden is on, like 6 nations only. How do you think? Please go ahead. The microphone.
Well, I think there's a different dynamic at play in different situations. There are certain situations where migrants from poor countries are going to rich countries, such as the United States. In those countries, they may be very useful to the economy. I believe they're useful. Migrants to the United States help cultivate and reap our crops. They help in landscaping and construction and domestic work. These aren't jobs that are being stolen from people already citizens. So I think for those countries it can be a boon, and there it lies on politicians to turn the table on these, I guess, counterproductive descriptions of these migration patterns. I mean, yes, they originate in problems, but they could end in win-win solutions. And it's up to politicians to change the narrative, to make it a more positive narrative. Now in terms of poor people going to poor or medium income countries, there again, it's much better to have the model that Turkey has of trying to integrate those people into urban or rural livelihoods, as opposed to living in camps. If they're earning livelihoods, they pay taxes, they purchase goods and services. If they're in camps, they stagnate, they don't work, and they have to, and it's not a life.
So you need it has to be the same culture. If you're lucky like us, the Southeast, you have seen the places where they have migrated or they have moved. those are the places where they speak Arabic, and they are very comfortable in these areas. If you're lucky, then fine, you can distribute them in these places. Then, well, it looks. So you have been working for the desalination research. I would come to that. Do you think desalination is the ultimate solution to water crisis? What is the cost now per cubic meter? It was.
It depends. There's a lot of propaganda. There's a lot of state propaganda around the price of desalination. The cheapest commercial at the moment is about 50 US cent
50 cents
per cubic meter. As I said yesterday, the difference between the cheapest on earth and the 20th cheapest on earth, from 50 cent to $1.50, is probably not technological. It's probably what's built into the pricing. As I said, it's like when you do the net present value of a project, it's what you put into that Excel sheet. So some countries will obviously have a decommissioning cost. They will have cost of environmental protection. They will have all sorts of regulatory costs in there. Some countries won't. So it's very hard, and these are commercially very, very sensitive costs. But 50 cent upwards is where we are now. It's not a panacea. It is incredibly energy intensive. The reverse osmosis systems we have at the moment, you're really coming up against the laws of physics now in terms of energy you put in and salt out of water you get out. So very, very advanced, very good. But probably before a state moves to large-scale desalination, it would need to look at its non-revenue water, how much water is leaking from the systems, number one. It should really look at how it treats wastewater. I mean, wastewater, if you look at seawater, you're talking up to 35,000 parts per million salt. Wastewater, 2,000, 3,000. It's much, much cheaper and more efficient to recycle wastewater, and with every recycle in the system of wastewater, you're only putting 300 parts per million of salt back into it. So it's very, very cheap and efficient to come out. Obviously, for cultural reasons, a lot of people don't want to use wastewater, but in terms of the environment, certainly agriculture should all be using 100% wastewater everywhere on earth today. It's just a cheap way to do it. So it's not a panacea, but there are parts of the Arabian Gulf now that without desalination and air conditioning, human life is really not possible today.
Please go.
Actually, does this work? The mic? Yes? Okay, thank you. Yeah, I want to just add a quick comment to what Karen said. I would add desalination with renewable energy would be ultimately, it's my hope, actually, it's my dream, basically. I don't know whether it will come by my lifetime, but basically that's what I see, at least from our region, the Mediterranean region. You see, you have Spain now using desalination, you have Malta using desalination, Tunisia, my country, using desalination, Algeria, plus of course the Middle East where all the desalination started. He said clearly, definitely, the energy costs, and we know that the cost of renewable is going down dramatically, actually. So if we achieve one day some good research on this, I think that would be hopefully part of the solution, at least for the water supply. For irrigation, this is another story, I mean, because we know how much water is used for irrigation, I mean, in developing countries.
By renewable energy, you mean the solar energy or the wind energy? It's so diffused. I mean, in reverse osmosis, you go up to 50 bars and 60 bars. Can you achieve that, really? I mean, do we have solar reverse osmosis systems?
Yeah. You can if you have a base load, which is, in today's technology, come from gas or oil or dirty fuel, if you have the base load. But certainly in a country like Oman, certainly in Jordan, certainly in a lot of these countries, if the state were to say, we will give the private sector a fixed cost of X from solar. If you come in and build the solar, build, operate and maintain, and this will provide Y amount of energy for the 10 desalination plants we know we're going to need. It's a system whereby if governments give regulatory certainty to renewables, which isn't rocket science at this stage, can simply thrive. There is no reason why water. And the thing about desalination is, it's good to have 24-hour continuous energy, but you can just fill up a tank. And if the energy falls, well, the tank is there. Unless the energy stops immediately, you can hurt membranes. But if you have some type of backup to allow that energy fall slowly, you're actually okay.
So it's feasible. It's feasible. So we have a solution. We can predict before it happens. And if they are lucky to be near the seaside, we can have, and if they have sunshine, of course, we can solve the water problem. Am I right? If this 50 cents you have mentioned, does it include the capital cost, operational cost?
That's where the state propaganda comes in. So a
That's
lot
the
of
propaganda,
states will
because-
say, we are the best in the world, we can do it. And then when you ask for the breakdown of the figures, it's very, very hard to find. So that's why pricing negotiations between countries are incredibly difficult. Water negotiations between countries are very, very difficult, because what I include in a price or in a project, and what you, and I'm sure for our colleagues in the banks, this is, you know, calculating net present value of these things from state to state and culture to culture, are very, very, very difficult, and we don't really have international norms in this area yet.
And you mentioned the reuse of wastewater. Probably you mean for irrigation, not for drinking, is it?
Culturally, that's acceptable in some places and in some places not. Singapore, for example, Singapore has negligible amounts of rainwater, and Singapore has no water problem and won't have water problem. They don't for the next 60 years. I mean, they're fine. And that's purely because of peace, development, and a cultural sphere that allows for this.
So in countries where we have water scarcity, about 90% is used for irrigation. So that can be a solution. So we are finding something, yes. You have also worked in the peace processes. I mean, can the refugees help in the peace processes? How can they be helpful?
Well, I mean, peace processes are useful in stopping the silly wars that stop migration crisis. And even when it's done, I mean, the important thing and what a peace process is for really is keeping the lines of communication open, allowing everybody sit together with dignity and with their head held high and leave with a victory together. What we've done in my organization is we've taken an old international relations infrastructure from the multilateral track of the Middle East peace process from the 90s, which had sort of become moribund, and then introduced the Irish peace process methodology into it, supported by the governments of Palestine, Jordan and Israel, United States, Japan, Korea, Oman, Qatar and several others. So what we do is we create, similar to the Irish approach, was to create a process which is all the members are joint guarantors, joint owners and equal, absolute co-equal partners in that process. And what you do by this approach is you create an incredibly resilient diplomatic pipeline through which you can put different just communications or more detailed things depending on the external environment. And its approach which is replicable. We have a formal mandate to develop the organisation as a model organisation for states seeking to use transboundary environmental issues in the support of a peace process. And so that's obviously of use in all of these things. But coming back to what I've said before, no peace process, no NGO, no bank, no anything is of any good unless you have international norms, which, I mean, people have to act in terms of justice and peace.
Thank you. We have not given much floor to Gonzalez. So increasing employment opportunities in the water sector, do you think it helps the refugee countries, refugee-giving countries, especially in the water sector?
Yes, thank you. Of course, water sometimes can be a problem when there is no water, but it can be an opportunity because there are sectors related with water which can create jobs. By the way, we, Union for the Mediterranean, we are working on the link water employment and migration for a long time, even though we are a young organization. In your institute in Istanbul, we will organize a laboratory on water employment and migration on the 19th and 20th of November. It is not the first one. We organized another one in Barcelona last year with all the stakeholders and international organizations, 32 people from different sectors, and we are working on that. I mean, water sector related jobs can be created. They are already being created. And this is something that looks at first sight like surprising, but it is it is coming, and of course it can help to alleviate the problems in those countries suffering from drought and water scarcity. Just to remind you that you see the situation in Syria now. In 2007, there was a terrible drought in Syria. There was no water. Then the following years, the prices of wheat, flour, bread, more than doubled. This ended up in a political revolution. Politics didn't help, maybe, but it was also a trigger. But this ended up in a sort of revolt in 2011. We are 2019. We are still there. So what is in the origin of problems is the lack of water, but related to jobs, there is a lot that can be done. The Union for the Mediterranean, we have since 2017 a water agenda, which is very much focused on being practical. It's pragmatic. It's good to come here and dialogue and give ideas and throw ideas. This is good, but we need to act. We need to react. We are, water employment is real. We are working on that. Thanks to you for your help, for your institute, and this is a sector where we can create many jobs, a lot of employment.
Thank you. You also, I think you are an expert in the Mediterranean countries. You have worked really on that. Are there specific, you were going to comment on this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No worries.
Yeah.
So we can definitely orient employment and development policies to spur the type of growth that countries need. So I'd say based on two principles. The first principle is do no harm. Don't pursue development policies that are going to exacerbate water stress. And that sounds reasonable enough, but you'd be surprised how many times water-thirsty crops like cotton or sugar or rice are cultivated in either dry places or places of high stress. So we have to dissuade countries from pursuing those types of measures. Also, food self-sufficiency policies in the absence of water seems like it buys you security, but in the long run, it really doesn't. All you end up doing is depleting your water, and eventually the drought hits, and you fall into crisis.
I think you're developing a model. I'm sorry, I'm intervening, but you're developing a model on food as well.
Yes,
should we know?
Yes, we have a new tool called Aqueduct Food, and we're cross-referencing the world's food production system with a number of global water risk indicators. It's together with IFPRI. They're doing the food, the global food model for us.
He's taking notes again, so. Yeah, I think you have.
I'll send you the link, don't worry.
I just want to comment on the question on employment creation. And I think that in most of the hotspots, the opportunity to develop infrastructure definitely is an opportunity for employment creation. First, temporary during the construction phase, using a lot of members of the community to provide labor, and it's infrastructure, so it takes a while. So I think there's always that opportunity for temporary. There's also, these facilities need to be managed after construction, and to the extent that most of them are going to be managed locally, that's also an opportunity for permanent employment creation. And to add to that, the fact that some of those facilities will be used for broader livelihood improvements with possibility to improve nutrition, as was mentioned, but also that it could possibly generate some income. So I think as long as you're developing infrastructure, and in some cases it's going to be dispersed, so it can have quite a wide scope geographically. It's a huge opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let me ask about the Mediterranean one. We have 7 minutes left. I'd like to take some questions from the audience as well. Very shortly, I mean, you worked on the Mediterranean region. Are there specific water scarcity issues in the Mediterranean region, different than other regions, or, you know? There's one working. Yeah.
Sorry for the microphone. Last week we had in Barcelona the what we call the regional forum. Is the gathering of all Minister of Foreign Affairs of the 43 countries members of the Union Mediterranean, including Hungary, by the way. And we publicized a very striking report on the impact of climate change on the Mediterranean. We found out that after the Arctic, the Mediterranean is the second most impacted region in the whole planet due to climate change. So that comes to your question. Of course, there is a water problem, water scarcity, water stress is a consequence of this huge impact. I think when we talk about climate change, we were thinking in general in the rise of the level of the sea, the Sahara Desert, some areas and the small islands that will be covered by water. But I think we never realized until now that the Mediterranean, we are the hottest spot. We are here, and the Mediterranean is just next door. So that's why we are trying to coordinate all member states of our organization to do more things regarding water. I think it's something. It's not, as I said before, an environmental issue only anymore. It's politics, and it's a very sensitive politics.
Thank you. Well, can I say that water scarcity is the main factor for migration, but it's not the only factor. Can I summarize it that way? Do we all agree on that? Or yeah, okay. Thank you. So I have 5 minutes left. I would like to take questions from the audience. I'm sure you have lots of questions to our. Yes, please. We have a second one here. We have the one at the back. Then I'll take your question.
My name is Henk Holtslag. I'm from the Smart Center Group, which is a group of water training centers in mainly Africa. I have a question to the panel. We have heard the investment can increase the number of people, but what about reducing cost? If we can reduce the cost by 50% of water infrastructure, you can have 2 times more people. And there's a lot of new technologies, especially for rural areas, that can be produced locally. The big challenge there is capacity building. Mr. Bergkamp of the IWA 3 years ago in Stockholm said we need 3 million WASH practitioners to reach the SDG 6. Now, who is going to invest in this capacity building? Is it banks? Is it donors? Is it NGOs? Is it government? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to answer the questions when they are hot. Should we do it like this? I mean, will the banks answer first? Or then I'll come to your question instead of collecting all of them. Then I forget what the question was. So. Yes, please, go ahead. Somebody? Yeah.
Well, actually, you asked about the question about the capacity building. Who can do that? And you listed a number of stakeholders. I would say all of them, actually. You should not give this task to banks only or to government only or to vocational training or wherever. I mean, I think it's joint action in terms of capacity building. Regarding reducing the cost, definitely. I mean, these are 2 sides of the equation, okay? And if we can work on that part and by reducing the cost, using maybe modern technology and new tools, etc. Well, of course, I mean, we will. I mean, this is something we should all be happy and pleased to adopt.
Thank you. I think that she wants to add.
Just to agree that it's everyone, and I would add very much, especially given the topic of discussion, the local communities themselves. I think that all our projects include capacity development, actually more broadly, institutional development all the way down. And in this particular case, we find that there are other organizations on the ground that are better equipped to do that than we can, to the extent that we can facilitate those organizations. But, I agree with my colleague here that it's going to have to be everyone. In terms of cutting costs, I'm looking at it more broadly and thinking that if you're working in hotspots, working with local groups, where you leave capacity behind that they can use for broader development. I think to the extent that you use as much as possible available skills, available resources, available technologies. I agree with you that technology isn't the main impediment. But I find that working locally, starting new things, starting new, ensuring that there is more efficiency in the way we use resources, but also in the way we use water, the water that comes out of the investments that we make. So it's everybody, and yes, we can reduce costs.
No comments. We have the second question. We have about 1.5 minutes. Yeah.
Mitja Bricel, Slovenia, Sava River Basin Commission. We do have some experiences with the crisis and even refugees and post-war, let's say, problems and now solutions. But my question to you is, we heard a lot about needed actions now and also responsibility. Now my question to you is, really not to mix the reasons for the crisis and the consequences of the crisis. These are very important two dimensions. And what we are doing with the, of course, consequences of the crisis to repair and to do our best, and who will take about the reasons for the crisis. This is first question. And the second is about the ethics of policies, of the, let's say, scientific approach and the implementation, about the water ethics, about the ethics of investments, about the ethics of doing business in the crisis situations. This is something what I'm very interested to, let's say, continue debate because we are dealing with this Sava region and we believe that we are successful, but we are taking care that this is not business as usual. And who is the partner on the ground to not to be the business as usual? Thank you.
That was a hard question. Any volunteers? You go ahead. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So I think with any problem, you have the drivers of the problem, the impacts of the problem, and perhaps the point you wanted to make is if you want to solve the problem, don't try to solve the impacts or the symptoms. Look at the drivers. If it's population, do something about population. If it's lack of technologies, implement technology. So that requires a careful evaluation of the situation on the ground. As for who is part of the solution, that's not business as usual. There you do a stakeholder analysis, but presumably it's different water users who are coming in some kind of conflict with each other, perhaps not violent conflict, but there may be dissatisfaction, there may be pent-up frustration.
Yeah, please go.
I thank you very much for your question. I think it's very important what you say about the respect of ethics when there is a crisis, a humanitarian crisis. And this is why, as I said before also, we have to respect countries like Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan that are now suffering this mass migration due to conflict, and with the help of the international community, because this is an issue that has to be tackled among all of us. It cannot be tackled by a single country. This has to be tackled to be solved and not to make business out of it. I completely agree with your comment.
About ethics of investment, can we say we should not profit? It should not be a profit business. Would the banks agree with that? Yeah. Of course. Another question.
The banks are not definitely going to profit.
You don't have profit.
No, not. For, I mean, we're not where we finance investments. Maybe the recipients at the end of the line could make, depending on how they use the water. But for the banks, it's really not the intention.
I think this question can be a real another, maybe another panel. So we had the third question here, please. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be very controversial. It's good in this to be on the other side. I'll go to the topic, which is migration.
Okay.
I come from a region where kids are dying on boats, leaving the shores of Senegal and Gambia in pirogue to go to Europe, and 80% of them are dying. We haven't touched that. Mr. Gonzalez has touched it. Why are they moving? Basically poverty. Nothing to do. And they are coming from rural areas. They come to the city just to join the boats. Those in the city are not going. So how do we address that poverty? That's where I'll be very controversial. We have the banks. Should we not start looking at different models of economic development? Because the models we've been using for the past 20, 30 years hasn't done much to address poverty. Last night, I did not sleep. I was watching the Democratic candidates on TV, and they have all changed. They are talking of the development model of America doesn't help America. That's why they are all talking of no one to be left behind. So we should change. They are saying that everybody should have health care, but in a different way. But stress for water. When, as a citizen of a country, applies for the bank, either for loan or whatever, by the time my application goes in, by the time I get the money, people have died. The process is so long, a bureaucratic process, that there is no fast track. These are the issues that we should address. We should change the paradigm. We should change the way we think. We should change the way we address issues. I'm talking on behalf of that poor guy in the rural area, not the academic guy or the privileged professional. He doesn't know all of these things. He just wants to improve his life. From the Islamic Development Bank, America, they migrate. Yesterday, in Las Vegas that you quoted, they quoted it yesterday. One of the candidates said, you have the biggest casinos. People come and spend money. Just outside of the casinos, people are sleeping in gutters. They are sleeping in gutters. So it's all about poverty. They want to improve. How are we going to address that? And using water as the platform, as what we call in French, motor de développement. These are the issues that I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, hot question. Any volunteers? Do you want to change the whole system? Make it, yep, you want to answer? Yeah, please.
I'll touch it because I'm partial to people who want to rock the boat. I like to rock the boat too. I'll just kind of answer the African-European question by talking about America. That way I can speak as somebody who inhabits the region. In Central America, there's been a very bad 5-year drought linked to El Nino conditions. And there have been many farmers. They farm on a rain-fed basis. They're very poor, under the poverty line. A lot of those people can no longer hold on, and they've decided to migrate. And in some cases, they migrate to cities. In some cases, they decide to migrate to the United States. I've already talked about how those migrants should be considered a boon to our economy, not a bane. But I also want to point out that the United States, until recently, was providing a lot of development aid to Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Mr. Trump cut that aid, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. So, we have to help those people develop. I can only think of some very cynical reasons why he cut that aid. And it's because it may benefit him politically.
Thank you. Well, we are over time, about 7 minutes. I would like to thank our panelists and the keynote speakers. Thank you very much. It was a quite interesting panel. And I'd like to thank the government of Hungary for their hospitality and giving us this chance to meet each other and talk to each other. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sachi, for the moderation and the panelists for the participation. It's such an important and topical question that no wonder that you needed some more time. This doesn't mean that your coffee break will be longer, though. So we will hope to see you at 11:30 back here. Let me just tell you that there are two side events happening in the break. One is in this building in Dunarum, titled Top Technologies and Strong Local Partnerships for Clean Drinking Water. It's organized by LATMA-aided NGO platform. The other will be in Tisarum in Building D, entitled Who is at the Table? Mobilizing for a Water Secure World, organized by the Global Water Partnership. See you back at 11:30. Enjoy your break.